Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So we've almost made it. This is number 4 out of 5 on my series doing the Planeswalkers from Magic the Gathering. So far we've done Liliana, Jace, and Chandra. Today we'll be doing Garruk. If you want to check any of those out, there'll be a link in the iCard above or a link in the description below. I think today's video came out pretty good, so let's get into the video. Like all the ones before it, I wanted Garruk to have glowing eyes. However, in most of his card art, he actually has bluish eyes. But since he's a green planeswalker, I actually wanted to do it where he had green glowing eyes because I thought that would work a little better together. As usual, I start by putting down the green that I want to have glowing in the eye and then going back and lightening up certain areas with the colorless blender where I can go back and put more green down where I want the darker highlights in the eyes. Using a green color pencil, I quickly give the eyes an outline and more of a shape before I then move on to using my very light skin tone to put in a light base of color into the skin. And since both of his eyes are going to be in shadow from his helmet, I'm going to keep building color up, going darker and darker on the skin tones and building up a very deep shadow. And then using a few color pencils, I go back and add more detail into the shadows. I continue to do this to add the eyes under the eyelid and also the eyelashes. Moving on to the helmet, I wanted to make sure that it kept a realistic metal look to it, and I know that my light source is going to be coming in from the left side of his face. So I first quickly lay down a full layer of gray over the area that I'm going to be working on. And then I'm going to take the same color that I first laid that layer down and start going over it again where I want those darker highlights, making sure to leave areas where there are going to be bright highlights because of the way metal shines. Then similar to the skin, I'm going to keep working in darker and darker grays as I go. Last thing on this part of the metal will always reflect the other colors that are around it, and so I wanted to bring in some of those colors, which is why I first laid down a little bit of blue before blending it back in with a gray marker to give it some lighter highlights, and then go back in with a little bit of violet before I blend it back out with gray in the darker highlights of the helmet. That way it brings more color into it. Last, to even out some of the metal tones, I use a color pencil to lightly blend in color, mostly where my darker regions are going to be because of the way the color pencil is going to go down. Then to give a more defined look to the helmet, I'm going to outline it with a color pencil as well, making sure to match the darkness of the pencil I'm using to the color of that region of the helmet. And then using the same exact process, I'm going to work my way through the other two regions of the helmet, filling in the rest of the color as I go. One thing I also want to do is I felt like it needed one more color blended into it, so I brought in a green color that I blended in as well that acts as a darker highlight to the helmet. So one thing that happened when I was working on the darker side of the helmet is I blended so many colors in together that the paper started getting saturated. Then the ink started soaking into areas of the paper that I didn't want it to, which is called bleed. You never want to have bleed, but a lot of times you can try to fix it. However, in this one, I got a lot more bleed than I was expecting. It sucks. You can try to fix it with the colorless blender by trying to push the ink back into the boundary you were working on, but in this one, it just wasn't working out. So one thing I will be able to do is in post, it's pretty much as easy as going into any post-processing software and just editing out that area color using the other white in the background. Moving on to the leather holders that he has for the tusks on each side of his head, I start out with a light yellowish brown, lay down a full layer before moving back with my colorless blender and moving some of the ink out of the way to create a few highlights before taking my colorless blender and pushing some of the ink back out of the way to create a few highlights. I take a darker brown and go over the areas where I want some darker color, and after blending that together, I take a darker brown and go over it once more. And then using a color pencil, I go in and give it more detail, which I then do on the other side since it's the same exact thing. The only difference is since it's on the dark side of the helmet, they'll have more darker areas that I'll fill in. Then moving on to the rest of the face, like with the eyes, I start with my lightest skin tone and put down a full layer of color. Since Garruk has more of an olive skin, I then use more of an orange toned Copic marker to put in the darker highlights. I use more of a peach colored skin tone to add in the darker highlights before I use a warmer, darker peach tone to add in more of the highlights. And then I repeat this on the darker side, just putting in more darker colors where it's in shadows. Now, one thing I wanted to make sure, around the chin, even though Garruk will have a beard in the end, you always want to lay down your lighter colors first. And in this case, that will be the skin tone over the darker browns of the beard. And to make sure that there were no white pieces left behind and I knew I'd be able to put the darker brown tones over top the skin tones, I made sure to color in all of the face before I knew I'd go back to do the beard. And then to finish off the face like normal, I just add a bit more color pencil to match the tones that I had. So for the horns on each side of his face, I wanted to do something similar to how I was doing his beard. I wanted to make sure I had all the light colors put down before I would go back with my darker colors. So the first thing I did was use a light gray and put down where the dark areas would be before going over it with warmer grays to give it more depth. For the leather straps that were along the horn, I used the same 3 colors that I used for the leather straps on the side of the helmet and applicated them in the same exact way, putting my lightest down and then working my darker colors in before outlining them in a little colored pencil so that they had more detail. And then I did this up and down both of the horns. Now moving back to the beard, I know I wanted it to have a lot of depth, but I still need to start with my lighter colors. So I first start by putting down some lighter grays before I start building up the browns in the beard, going from lightest to darkest like normal, building up more color over time. And even a few strokes I put in a little bit of green, the blue, and the purple to give a little bit of color balance throughout the piece before finishing off. And then the last thing I do to give the beard a bit more detail is use a variety of color pencils to give the beard more depth in the colors that it has. So the last thing that had to be done on the piece was his fur overcoat, which is kind of like a shawl that hangs just over his shoulders. The colors that I use are going to be very similar to the ones that are in the leather, however with the fur coat it'll end up coming out a lot darker. But I still lay down my lightest colors before going over it with the darker ones, building up my colors over time, but this time I use a much darker brown that I blend into the fur. One thing I wanted to make sure to keep the texture of the fur itself is to keep my Copic going in one direction so that it would end in a point, giving natural lines to the fur coat that he's wearing. And then like everything else, to balance out the piece, I use a variety of color pencils to add a little bit more detail on the fur coat. However, I wanted to keep these colors a little more muted than they are in the beard. So I used fewer color pencils and I made sure they stayed closer together in color variation, except for the white that I used to do the brightest highlight. And then last but not least was just finishing off his 2 spikes that he wears on the back of his shoulder, which is done the same exact way that I did the horns, putting down a very light gray before going over it with a few warmer tones, and then finishing it off with a little bit of color pencil. So overall, I think this one came out pretty good. I like the more olive skin tone that I put into the character. This is a pretty big change than the last one I did, which was Liliana, where I had to do an incredibly light skin tone, and this is almost going in the exact opposite direction. The nice thing is that was a bit easier to do and build up the color for. As like the Liliana one, I added a lot more color pencil into this piece, which I think defined it a lot more, not only in the edges, it made some of the highlights pop more and the shadows be a bit more pronounced, making the overall piece work better together. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like this, like Ajani, which I'm going to be doing next week, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below. And if you like this video, go ahead and leave it a thumbs up. And if you have anything that you think you want me to draw, go ahead and leave it in the comment below. As always, I'll see you guys in the next one. Now go make something. And that's it.